Professor Cotler is on his way from Toronto as we speak. The hotel in Toronto phoned to apologize for missing his wake-up call this morning. He missed his first plane, and he is now supposedly in a taxi between Dorval and here. He is scheduled to light a candle as part of the candle lighting ceremony, and we'll keep our eye on the door. But in the event that he arrives after the candles have been lit, it will be Consul General Gall who might light a candle on behalf of both of them. I'd like to acknowledge the distinguished presence in our midst of the Consul General of Israel, Mr. Daniel Gall, Mr. Ferenc Persani, the Consul General of Hungary, the Consul of Poland, and Mrs. Ulrike Biar, the Consul General of Austria. If I've missed any distinguished consuls, maybe someone will draw my attention. We will begin with the candle lighting ceremony and then proceed to the prayer, and following which Professor Cotler will present his discussion of the topic, and he will be introduced by Professor Stan Brooks. Samantha Mintz asked for matches. A request for matches.
I'd like to begin the candle lighting ceremony by reciting a poem by Primo Levi, who was a survivor of Auschwitz and wrote down his memories in a book entitled Survival in Auschwitz. And this poem is a memory, a legacy for future generations about the importance and need for memory and the need to remember the atrocities which have happened during the Holocaust. You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find returning in the evening hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold, like a frog in winter. Meditate that this came about. I commend these words to you. Carve them in your hearts, at home in the street, going to bed, rising. Repeat them to your children, or may your house fall apart. May illness impede you. May your children turn their faces from you. I'd like to call on Eva and Willie Sterner, Holocaust survivors, to light the first memorial candle. I would now like to call on Mr. Daniel Gall, the Consul General of Israel, to light the second memorial candle. The third memorial candle will be lit by Sister Françoise Barbier, Academic Dean, Marianopolis College. fourth candle will be lit by Dr. Phyllis Kramer, Chaplaincy Service, Marianopolis College, and Ms. Karen Dorr, Modern Languages Department, Marianopolis College. The fifth candle will be lit by Geneviève Pelletier and Hiroa Miura, Humanities class, Holocaust Humanities class. The sixth memorial candle will be lit by Alona Amsel and Jason Berger, grandchildren of survivors, who will then conclude with a poem, which is again a hope, a link for the future and for future generations.
To Go Home by Solomon R. Kaplinsky. I owe it to you, Mom and Dad, even though you rest in the earth, to go home. I owe it to you, my bubbies and zadies, whom I never knew, and who could never spoil me, and were shoved alive in mass burial pits in the Punari forests, to go home. Home conjures up images of warm, familiar smells, laughter, security, and peace of mind.
Poland may have been home then, but it's really hell on earth. It shakes you to the very core. It makes you fear for man. So why go back, you may ask? To play homage, to be the link, to bear witness, to take care of the past.
I would now like to call on Zvi Engel to please recite the Elma Lerachamim. Everyone please.
El malei rachamim shochein bamromim hamitzei menucha nechona al kanfei ashchina b'ma'alot kedoshim utehorim kezohar harakia mazhirim et nishmot kol hakedoshim v'hatehorim shehu metu v'shenehergu v'shenishchatu v'shenisrafu v'shenitbeu v'shenechneku al kiddush Hashem al yedei hanazim ve'ozreihem be'Europa yimach shemam v'zichram ba'avur shekol beit Yisrael mitpalalim bi'ad azkarat nishmotayhem began Eden tehei menuchatam lachein ba'al harachamim yastirem b'seiter knafav l'olamim v'yitzror hachaim et nishmotayhem Adonai hu nachlatam v'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkevotayhem v'nomar amen.
Kaddish is the traditional prayer for mourning of the dead. What's interesting about it, it does not mention death at all. What it does do is glorify God. And it glorifies God because He is suffering with us with the death of the 6 million. Yizkara v'yizkara shmei Rabbo, Belma Diva Robert Sevi Machmachel Sevi Bechayachonim Meyachonim Svaydichal Best Yisrael Bagalav Izman Kari Vemru Amen Yehesh Meira Bamarfalmo Meyamaya Yisporaf Yishabaf Yishapar Vishamai Venisa Say Venisa Darvi Salal Visalal Schmidt Gichu Brichu Leila Min Kol Professor Vishirasa Tishbichasa Venachamasa Dabri Malma Vemru Amen Yehesh Shalom Rabba Mishamai Bachayim Eleni Balkal Yisrael Vemru Amen. Thank you.
While we wait for the arrival of Professor Cotler, I would like to read a letter that I received this morning from Lawrence Bergman, member of the National Assembly for Darcy McGee. Dear Professor Kaplan, I am delighted to have attended the launching of the symposium on April 18, 1995. It was carried out with much decorum, dignity, and success. I regret that I will not be able to attend the lecture and the ceremony on Thursday, April 27th at Marianopolis College, as the National Assembly will then be in session. The symposium which you are coordinating is so meaningful at this moment in time when we are witnessing the horrible tragedies which have occurred recently. We hope and pray that symposiums such as yours can spread a positive message which will lead to a world of peace, tranquility, and harmony. With kind personal regards, I remain. Mr. Bergman called yesterday to announce to me also that the motion was read in the National Assembly in commemoration of Yom HaShoah, and I think today there will be some speeches, including his own, the text of which will be available later, speaking to the motion of commemoration. We are now embarrassingly looking at the door to see when Professor Cotler, I think that's the next item on the program. I think we'll have to wait patiently until he does arrive. I'm sure it'll be only a matter of minutes.
Polak, who has helped us a lot here at the college, as well as Brandy Burson, who cannot be here today, Samantha Mintz, Alona Amsel, and, well, I would like to thank Rebecca.
And I would like to thank Beth.
And, well, to anyone else here at the college, Karen Dorr and Helga Rudolph, who have just given us a lot of support and encouragement, and to all of you who have made this symposium possible and who have made these 2 weeks run so smoothly, we would just like to thank you and give you some due applause.
Students of the college, members of the college community at large, visitors, friends, distinguished guests, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany and the liberation of tens of thousands of Jews from the insanity and the atrocities of Nazi death camps. On behalf of the International Studies Program, I would like to welcome you to the last lecture in the Esther and Peter Kleinman's second annual CJEP Holocaust Symposium. This lecture, entitled Holocaust Denial, Free Expression or Incitement to Hatred, is co-sponsored by the ISP of Marianopolis with the participation of the Consul General of Israel, Mr. Daniel Gal. As coordinator of the ISP, I express the very deep-felt honor of my colleagues in having so distinguished a guest speaker as Professor Cotler, associated with the activities of our programs. The ISP program focuses
Thank you really for their very kind and overly generous words of introduction. Mr. Chairman, the Consul General of Israel and Poland that I understand are with us today. And as I look around, in particular, I'm delighted to see the number of young people who are present here, because they represent really the best guarantee for the Jewish future and the future of human rights. And I want to make particular mention and pay express words of appreciation to Neil Kaplan for really his yeoman efforts in organizing this entire symposium, and those faculty and students associated with him and Hillel Foundation in this common enterprise. And I'm delighted to be able to be here today, to participate in what I would like to regard our common cause of the struggle for human rights and human dignity in our time, of fidelity to truth, to Holocaust remembrance, to witness testimony, to the integrity of memory, to justice as the organizing idioms of this struggle, particularly as we convene on the very day of Yom HaShoah, of the Day of Holocaust Remembrance. The importance of which was captured in the words of the Supreme Court of Germany itself on September 18, 1979, where, in respect to a trial of a Holocaust denier, the Supreme Court of Germany not only took judicial notice of the Holocaust, which it characterized, and I quote, as the most horrific crime in history, but characterized Holocaust denial itself as a crime against Holocaust remembrance, as the most pernicious of group libels. The whole reflected in the words, indeed in the witness, of Pope John Paul II himself 16 years ago, when in a visit to Oswiecim, the Auschwitz death camp, in June 1979, he said as follows, and I quote, "I kneel before the inscription in Hebrew. This inscription consecrates the memory of the people whose sons and daughters were intended for total extermination. It is not permissible for anyone to pass this inscription with indifference." This struggle, then, for human rights and human dignity, this struggle against Holocaust denial, a Holocaust denial which is not only the cutting edge of anti-Semitism, old and new, but the cutting edge of racist anthropology, of racist hatred, old and new, must now be seen really as being our struggle, as being in the most profound existential sense the struggle for ourselves. Because in what we say, or more importantly, in what we will do, in our good deeds, we here both individually and collectively will be making a statement about ourselves as a people. Indeed, we will be making a statement about ourselves as people. I must say that whenever I have the privilege, because that's how I regard it, the privilege to speak on a subject as profound as it is painful on the Holocaust, or as unfathomable as Holocaust denial, and to do so on the occasion of Yom HaShoah, of that International Day of Remembrance, I'm reminded of the plaintive words in the Yom Kippur prayer, Hineni ha'ani mimas, as it is put, that I really feel inadequate in word and in deed. For I have neither the wisdom of the scholar of the Holocaust nor the experience of the Holocaust survivor. I only know what my parents told me as a child, when I was old enough to try to understand this horror of horrors. That there are things in Jewish history that are too terrible to be believed, but they are not too terrible to have happened. These words, this remembrance, is really the psychological as well as philosophical backdrop for my remarks today, in a hope that some of these remarks will not only serve as an act of remembrance on the day of remembrance, but in a hope, and particularly for the young people who are here, that they may serve as a remembrance to act against evil wherever they may be. For we meet really at a critical historical juncture in both the struggle for human rights in general and the struggle against racism and Holocaust denial, which I take to be part of that incitement to racial hatred, and against this incitement to racial hatred in particular. Where, on the one hand, if one were to take a snapshot of the human condition over the last 5-10 years, there has been a literal explosion of human rights, where human rights is spoken of as being the new secular religion of our time, where things that were thought to be impossible have not only happened in the last 5 or 10 years, but indeed have been forgotten or are in danger of being forgotten. Think about it for a moment. Hundreds of millions of people now enjoy the franchise in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, who as little as 10 or even in some instances 7 or 5 years ago would have risked exile or imprisonment for just advocating the exercise of the electoral franchise. Where democracy is on the march from Central Asia to Central America. Where in Africa, Namibia has been liberated from South Africa. Nelson Mandela liberated after 28 years in a South African prison to become president of apartheid. And South Africa itself is being liberated from the worst post-Nazi racism in our collective experience, namely apartheid itself. And what is true of this human rights revolution could well be said to be true as well of a revolution not only in the human condition, but in the Jewish condition. And again, a snapshot of the last 5-10 years, very quickly, very graphically, where Soviet totalitarianism, as Gorbachev himself characterized it, has not only, if I may borrow a Marxist metaphor, has not only withered away, but the object of that totalitarianism, namely Zionism, has prevailed. Where closed borders, the metaphor of the post-war condition for oppressed Jewry in the former Soviet Union, Syria, and Ethiopia, has been turned on its head. And indeed, the exodus of Soviet, of Syrian, of Ethiopian Jews resonates not only as a humanitarian metaphor, but I would say as a human miracle. Where the Zionism is racism resolution has been repealed, where Israel has entered into a historic declaration of principles with the Palestinians, into a historic peace treaty with Jordan, where, in a word, Israel has returned, as it has been said, to diplomatic history, while anti-Semitism has been characterized as now being consigned to the scrap heaps of history. But I suspect that as I've been giving you this graphic, almost telegraphic summary of the human condition and the Jewish condition of the last 5 years, of the revolution in human rights and the revolution in the condition of the Jewish people in Israel, there may be many amongst you, particularly I suspect the survivors amongst you, those who I regard as the bearers of the seismograph of Jewish memory, bearers of the seismograph of the Jewish condition, who've been thinking to themselves, if things appear to be so good, why do they appear to be so bad? And not only in the Jewish condition, but indeed in the human condition. For at the same time that we have been witnessing this explosion in human rights, in a kind of Dickensian dialectic that Charles Dickens, who spoke of the best of times and the worst of times, would have himself appreciated. The violations of human rights continue unabated. Indeed, thank you for the water, but I don't yet hope I need it. And the fragility of the human condition stands uniquely exposed. The homeless of America, the hungry of Africa, the imprisoned in Asia and elsewhere can be forgiven if they believe that the human rights revolution has somehow passed them by. While the silent tragedy of the Kurds, the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, the agony in Africa of Sudan, Angola, the genocide, and yes, there is no other word for it, the genocide in Rwanda. And while there are no analogies, and I would not make any analogies to the Holocaust, one cannot deny that what has taken place in Rwanda in our time is indeed genocide. The attempted killing off of a people in whole or in part simply because of their race, religion, national or ethnic origin, as the Genocide Convention would itself characterize it. And what is true of this not only fragility of the human condition, but a human condition in which the violations of human rights continue unabated, as I mentioned, also finds echo and expression in the fragility of the Jewish condition, lending credence really to the notion of anti-Semitism as tragically enough both an endemic and enduring hatred. And with the emergence of Holocaust denial as its organizing core. Where at the same time that the Zionism is racism resolution was repealed, what many did not know is that 45 nations of the Islamic Conference met at the same time to reaffirm their commitment to the Zionism is racism libel. Where Iran has decreed an international fatwa, an international execution decree against an entire people and state, the state of Israel, just as they issued a fatwa, an execution decree against the Muslim writer Salman Rushdie. And so Israel emerges, as it were, not only as it was classically spoken of as the Jew among the nations, but if I may apply this metaphorically to the Iranian fatwa against Israel, as the Salman Rushdie of the nations for Islamic fundamentalists who would seek to destroy her. Where the covenant, not the pamphlet, but the covenant of Hamas openly calls, and these are their words, not my ascription to them, for the killing of Jews wherever they may be, a standing incitement to murder. The only post-Nazi genocidal call for the killing of a people in any charter which seeks to institutionalize racism as a matter of law. Where in the former Soviet Union, the dialectics of glasnost and perestroika have unleashed the twin demons of racism and anti-Semitism. And so the new extremist Russian right blames the Jews for the bringing about of communism, and the old extremist communist left blames the Jews for the downfall of communism. Either way, the Jew is caught in a pincer movement of the right and the left. And with the emergence in the former Soviet Union, and particularly in Russia, of the red, brown, right, left, communist, Nazi, joint extremist movement, the old Tsarist clarion call echoes once again. Bei Zhidov Spasia Rusi, beat the Jews and save Russia, has found expression once again, in an interview just 3 weeks ago in The Economist with the leaders of the various Pamiats or extremist movements in the former Soviet Union, where coded, and at times not so coded, anti-Semitic discourse enters into the mainstream of Western political conversation, be it in the reference by Le Pen in France, the leader of the National Front Party, and I might remind you that in the first round of the French elections just 10 days ago, Le Pen got 16% of the French vote. This same Le Pen dismissed the Holocaust, as he put it, as quote-unquote a detail. Or the racist Jew-baiting in America of a David Duke, or even a Patrick Buchanan, now a candidate for the Republican nomination for president on the right, or a Louis Farrakhan on the left. Or the characterization in England of a leading Holocaust denier, such as David Irving, as quote-unquote, and this is the Sunday Times doing it, a distinguished British historian. Or the hiring even of this same David Irving by the Sunday Times newspaper to do an analysis of the diaries of the Nazi Goebbels diaries. And this, think about it, and this after David Irving had just hosted a conference of Holocaust deniers. Where in Germany today neo-Nazis stalk the streets in search of l'étranger, the foreigner, torching Holocaust memorials in their path. And Rostock becomes the code word in the burning of Holocaust memorials in Germany for the new xenophobia in Germany. Where in innocent, neutral Sweden, the most scurrilous anti-Semitic poison since the Nazi Der Stürmer, to use the words of the former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, Per Ahlmark, who has written about this as decisively as any. And as he put it, this anti-Semitic poison continues to find expression in the regular broadcasts of Radio Islam. As much, one might say, an assault on the integrity of Islam as it is an assault on the integrity of Jews. For this pernicious Jew hatred is being carried out in the name of and under the cover of Islam itself. Where Holocaust denial emerges as one of the cutting edges of anti-Semitism, old and new, feeding off the fascination in our time with both conspiracies and with Jews, but engaging, as it itself alone can, in an international conspiracy to cover up the worst international crime in history, namely the Holocaust. Where classical anti-Jewish stereotypes find expression in the mainstream of Western, and indeed I would say the international proliferation of anti-Semitic books, pamphlets, leaflets, periodicals, greeting cards, and the like, whose themes, and again one must say not only regrettably and tragically, resonate with the enduring hatred of anti-Semitism. And I will not, for reasons of time, give you a catalog of these anti-Semitic stereotypes and caricatures. But I just want to bring one of them to your attention because of when it took place and how it took place. I'm referring to what took place several weeks ago at Kent State University in Ohio. A university which was marking the 25th anniversary of the protest against the Vietnam War. This was the university where there are many here who are too young to recall, but others amongst you who will recall, when in the midst of a protest against the Vietnam War in 1970, 4 students at Kent University, by happenstance, 3 of them happened to be Jews, 4 students at Kent University were murdered then by the National Guard, triggering a massive national protest against the Vietnam War in the United States itself. Well, at this university, on the occasion of the commemoration of the anti-Vietnam War, and for the second time in 6 months, a university subsidized pamphlet was distributed which says, among other things, the following: blaming the Jews, and I quote, for the decimation, defilement, cultural colonization, enslavement, and genocide of many of the world's people up until today. This is not the work of cranks and misfits, as the anti-Semitic Holocaust denial movement has been called. We are talking about a pamphlet that was issued and distributed at a mainstream American university, and which spoke of the Jews as, quote, having engineered the black African Holocaust and the genocide of American Indians by injecting smallpox into their blankets while they slept at night. And one of the most disturbing aspects of what occurred at Kent State is not only this scurrilous, pernicious, anti-Semitic pamphlet and its coterie of libels. Indeed, it is as much an assault on the inherent dignity of the human person as it is on the particular dignity of the Jewish people. What is so disturbing is that the protest against this pamphlet seems to have been anchored only amongst members of the Jewish community. And so it lends a kind of inference that if only the Jews protest about this attack on the Jews, then maybe there's something to it. Because if it was really as scurrilous, if it was really as racist as one characterizes it as being, would there not have been a generalized sense of moral indignation, indeed outrage, against this pamphlet? And so what one finds, that what is common to the Holocaust deniers in Canada like Keekstra and Zundel, or the Le Pen and Faurisson in France, or the Felderers and Holocaust deniers like him in Sweden, or the Smirnov, Astashvili, and other fellow Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites in the former Soviet Union, is that they are all part of an endemic and enduring Jew hatred, but which has added and incorporated the idiom of Holocaust denial as its contemporary and cutting edge. Indeed, what unites the radical right and the radical left, what constitutes today a criminal assault on Jewish memory as it constitutes an international criminal conspiracy. And I use that word with a full implication of what it means, of an international criminal conspiracy to cover up the worst crime in history. It is, in this instance, not only the ideology and pathology of Holocaust denial against Jews, but more. For just as the Holocaust was not a tragedy of the Jews, but a tragedy of civilization, in which Jews were its intended victims, so too is the denial of the Holocaust not just an assault on history of the Jews or on Jewish memory, but an assault on the history, the truth, the memory of civilized values themselves, indeed of civilization themselves, as survivors know only too well. Friends, whenever there is a gathering such as this, whenever, and particularly this year on the 50th anniversary of the commemoration of the Holocaust, when Jews and Holocaust survivors and men and women of goodwill all over the world commemorate the 50th anniversary, both the Holocaust and the liberation, there is this silent scream which echoes in the being of only those who can understand the full sense of this transcendental horror, the survivors themselves, for whom, as I mentioned, and who have been our primary messengers, as Peter and Esther Kleiman know only too well, the raison d'etre for the organizing of this symposium itself, that, as I mentioned, that there are things in Jewish history which are too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. That Oswiecim, the death camp of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau, Sobibor, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, that these are beyond vocabulary, beyond words. That in matters such as these, language mocks reality, just as reality mocks language, if not the law itself. For the Holocaust, as Elie Wiesel put it, and indeed put it in a succinct appreciation that remains unmatched. For the Holocaust was a war against the Jews, in which not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. A Holocaust which, as the noted and distinguished Holocaust scholar Yehuda Bauer has written about, was uniquely unique, raising the question of how does one bear witness to this transcendental horror. And Wiesel again, if we remembered everything, we could not stand the pain. And if we did not remember everything, we still could not stand the pain. For language breaks down and memory becomes even too painful to deal with it. Excuse me, this is a residue of a flu which I'm sure some of you have shared during the winter. I just got it in the spring. But think about it for a moment. One of the cruel ironies of Holocaust remembrance is that survivors have learned to fear that if they would tell the real truth of the horror, they might not be believed. And so the survivors have found themselves in that painful, worst of psychological positions of having to sanitize the true horror in order that they might be believed. For where does one have the language? And how does one bear witness when no words can express the singular horror of a child? The collective horror of 1.5 million Jewish children who entered the flames of the Holocaust inferno. Where no words can express the horrific horror of a grandparent or parent seeking to protect their child or grandchild as they entered into the mass grave. And an image that I'll never forget occurred 3.5 years ago when I was in Kiev, in the Ukraine, on the occasion then in October 1941 of the 50th anniversary of Babi Yar, where close to 34,000 Jews were killed in 2 days. But where for 50 years after this mass killing,
There was no memorial at Babi Yar. No place for remembrance. No place where